Hello, everyone. Welcome to the studio this afternoon. Today, rather, we are talking very devastating news from Turkey, the southern Turkey and the northern Syria, the earthquake that happened there. I have with me three gentlemen in the studio who will be talking about it. Of course, we have someone very important also in the studio. It's my professor. I think it's everyone's professor. Professor Anand is in the studio. Great to have you. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I feel nervous being interviewed by.
Don't be, don't be, sir. Of course, I'm going to allow you, gentlemen, introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Cole Griffin. I'm a MSc Economics and Finance student for development.
Yeah.
I am Oyini Joshua Adeoye. I'm just a recent graduate of international development and just finished my internship in Quake's piece, so it's an honor to be here.
Quite devastating. At least 47,000 people have been recorded dead from this earthquake. I'm very sad because in my head it's even worse because I see kids thrown, who have lost their homes. According to them, a lot of these kids don't even have, can't even identify their parents, and their parents are nowhere to be found. It's quite devastating, and that's why we brought Professor Anand to come and talk to us today in the studio. So, Professor, let's start with this. The first question: the UN announced today that we need clearance via the northern Syria border. Now, since 11 of these relief vehicles are stopped there prior to the earthquake, this area had been destroyed by an ongoing 12-year conflict. Mm-hmm. What point do humanitarian considerations overcome security concerns, since these people's lives depend on this and other relief items?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. I represent not only myself, but the Department of Peace Studies and International Development, which obviously, all of us were very saddened to hear this news. The other day when we had the vigil for Syria and Turkey, I was there to show solidarity for that purpose.
Sure.
in the atrium. Any such kind of natural, we call it natural disaster. Any such kind of havoc, if you like, it brings to the front already existing kind of inequalities in some ways. And so there are people who have been living in insecure accommodation, if you like, and insecure buildings, etc. And the earthquake, of course, 7.5, 7.6 magnitude, it's a very high, very powerful earthquake. Mm-hmm. And as we speak today, in fact, there has been another earthquake last night, 6.4.
Yes.
In normal 6.4 normal circumstances, 6.4 would have been a major earthquake. But because we had just a fortnight ago one which is 7.6, now we are talking about 6.4. But these are and because it is on a geological fault, in that particular region, U.S. United States Geological Services, they predict that this is because of that fault line, the earthquakes are likely to happen there, etc. Now, any such disaster, obviously our hearts go out to people who have lost everything and so on. But in this particular case, I think this is even more complex because it has happened in a region which has been at the center of this kind of the conflict. Sure. As you said, for more than 12 years, there has been the scale of this conflict. We forget that this is considered to be the second biggest war in the century, 21st century, only after the Congo War.
Sure.
So, and when you look at some of the numbers, even before the earthquake, so something like over 6 million people, Syrians, internally displaced, yes. Another 6 million, in seeking refuge in other countries, around 3.6 million people in Turkey itself. Sure. And surrounding regions. So I know you have a question on this later, but I think this context is important to keep in mind. So you asked the question, in terms of how do humanitarian needs and security considerations, how do they kind of, how can we resolve that? There is no easy answer. I don't think so. In the sense that it was an active conflict. It's not like it has happened and it has ceased or something, anything like that. It has been an active conflict, and it's a very multilateral international kind of conflict. There are a number of players involved. So the first priority in this kind of situation, as UN Secretary General also has mentioned and UNHCR also has mentioned, is to get humanitarian assistance to people who need it. So that should take a priority.
That's the first.
Absolutely, that should take a priority. And I think we can only put moral pressure on, because some of the people who are engaged in this conflict, they are not nations, they are not governments, they are armed groups. So we can only put moral pressure on all of these people to say that, okay, this is time to pause, and whatever is the cause for the war, that has to be paused at the moment. Humanitarian action has to take priority.
I feel like I want us to talk about the background of earthquake. For a lot of people who don't know, I mean, the world is on a plate, and this plate is evolving, and I think earthquake happens when there's a clash. What's your understanding of an earthquake? I feel like it's a question I'm going to ask everyone. Like, what's your understanding of an earthquake?
So it's called the tectonic plates. So these we see map in a different way, but we have to kind of, when we look at it geological, there are these different tectonic plates, and the geological activity happens when, where these tectonic plates kind of press against each other.
Sure.
So there's a kind of, that's the fault line, and then when there is a slip, so because, it's not a smooth surface, so there's a slip, and that causes that, shock. So this happens several kilometers below the Earth's surface. But the one which happened in Turkey, it's not very deep. This thing, it's a more shallow kind of a shock. That's where it has originated. So when that happens, that shock wave goes through the Earth, and it shakes everything. It's like, on this table now, if I shake it,
vibration.
Yeah. So that's what is happening.
Very sad. Especially, okay, Cole wants to ask a question.
Oh, what about?
What's your idea of what do you when you think of an earthquake? What comes to mind for you?
I think Dr. Anand kind of hit it on the head. I mean, my very basic, very very amateur understanding of it is there's tectonic plates moving under the Earth's surface, and they either collide and one slips above the other, or they rub against each other, and it can cause massive shock waves up to the Earth's surface, and which is where we feel the tremors. But I really don't know any more than that. It's not my area. Yeah.
I would go to the next question. Actually, do you want that question?
Yeah, I wanted to just hard on the earthquake. So I think one important thing about earthquakes is, funny thing is, most times places that have never experienced it get to experience. So you really cannot predict if a country in Asia is going to have it next, or in Africa, or even in Europe here, because basically Turkey is in Europe here. So it happens, it could be just once ever, and it's going to like rewrite the history of that particular place. So earthquake is very devastating, and
no, according to what I read, I feel like not all countries are going to be exposed to it, or have tendencies to have it. But because I know that the UK has very low tendency to actually be exposed to that. I feel like that's why a lot of people, and Cole and I were talking about this before this show, that when you see Japanese, their buildings, it's not even about the earthquake. It's about why is it affecting these buildings. It's because a lot of times these buildings are not made for it. For a Japanese building now, they have things that actually would
withstand
it.
Resilient design.
Seriously withstand it. And why is it that a lot of people are not even good? But that's a question for another day. So I need some doctor.
No. I think it's a very important question. If I may just a few seconds, because I think it's really important to understand this. Number one, we cannot predict where the next earthquake is going to happen or when it's going to happen. But we know the fault lines, so geological fault lines. So those are kind of areas where the risk is higher, if you like.
Indicators.
But, so that is one. Number two, you mentioned about the buildings in Japan and etc.
Yes,
So I think both Cole and Joshua would remember we talked about when we discussed issues related to corruption.
Yes.
There was a very important paper that was published in Nature in 2009 after the Japan and Haiti earthquakes. So both of them were 7.2, 7.3 magnitude, similar magnitude earthquakes, but the casualties in Haiti were almost 10 times greater than in Japan. And we find that actually, in this particular paper in Nature, so two researchers, they compared various earthquakes and fatalities, and they find that actually in countries where corruption is much higher, then earthquake tends to produce more fatalities. So what is the explanation? The explanation is that, whether buildings are not regulated properly, everybody builds, without any proper regulation, and standards are not maintained, quality of material may not be good, cement may be, adulterated and stuff like. So it is in every step of that. So it kind of, in general, we can say that in countries or contexts where governance quality is poor, then the same earthquake can produce much more devastating impact on people in terms of casualties, in terms of.
So we cannot shy away from the fact that somehow it's a governance, the quality of governance is a real factor for this. Wow, really sad. We've been chatting with Professor Anand, of course. Professor Anand is an environmental, economic, sustainable human development, right to water, institutional economics, governance, accountability. Hey, he's a specialist in environmental economics and public policy with the focus of the interface of urban economy, environment, and sustainability. Dr. Anand has held various leadership positions, including the head of Center for the International Development at Bradford. Currently, he is the PI of a 3-year British Academy founded project on infrastructure governance for inclusion, inclusive, smart, and sustainable cities. Wow, amazing! It's so great to be chatting with you. Previously, he had co-organized and led 2 international workshops at Cambridge and a major international conference in Bradford. So good to be chatting with you today, sir. So back to my next question. A doctor in Turkey had to the tap water, says that tap water is no longer suitable for drinking. I mean, so Prof, what do you think they could use to salvage this type of situation?
Yes. So in any calamity or situation like this, whether it is floods, whether it is earthquakes, major fire disasters, for example, any of these things, we find that infrastructure, especially civil infrastructure, is one of the first casualties. And so securing, water supplies and food, hygiene products, for example, for both children and women, these become very, very important, because otherwise what happens is you have a situation where people are displaced from their houses, and then they congregate, and then the secondary infections, those actually take much greater toll than the earthquake itself. So these are all avoidable or preventable causes, if you like. So having good kind of, establishing safe water supply becomes an immediate priority. In the past, a lot of, for example, when you would have been children, so in 2004 there was a major tsunami hit Banda Aceh in Indonesia, and several thousands of people died, and so the initial kind of airlifting of all the emergency supplies were clothes, but also water bottles. A lot of hundreds and thousands of water bottles were airlifted there. But now we also have new technologies emerging. In fact, some of our colleagues within the university, in the engineering faculty, they work on things like desalination, for example. So there are desalination. So these technologies, you can take any kind of water and then put it through, and then what comes out of that is cleaner water. So those kind of, because we can't airlift just water bottles. Of course, for immediate need that is needed. So you need to reestablish some of the secure water supplies, and because otherwise what happens is then the diarrhea, cholera, those kinds of things. In most of the previous kind of disasters, what we have seen is that actually the number of people killed by the earthquake or flood is smaller compared to the number of people who died because of the secondary infections, waterborne diseases. So it has to be controlled. So establishing water, safe water, toilets for these people to be able to use. So if you imagine 20,000 people living out of their house because they are afraid to return to the buildings. So we need to kind of think in terms of where are they going to use these services and how they can use them safely, and do they have soap, and and then hygiene products. Those are very, very important, I think. So all the emergency kind of aid organizations have very clearly prioritized this.
I was wondering if I could just take you back to the issue of building codes and regulations in less developed countries where they have substandard or even non-compliance with building codes, or even maybe they don't exist at all. So, I mean, I'm of the opinion that it's not necessarily the earthquake that kills people, it's the buildings collapsing. They're not designed to be resilient to them. What do you think is the best pathway for a country to develop its set of building codes and to ensure compliance with them as well?
Yeah. So obviously the pain of loss and human suffering is going to be important. So when these countries try to rebuild housing, they tend to build the best, most earthquake resistant kind of housing. But I think that is also a little bit problematic, because then what makes it is these buildings then become, compared to all other buildings, these buildings will become much more expensive to build, and attractive. So the more powerful people will get the benefit, advantage of those, and rather than people who actually need.
Leaving the masses to suffer also, because the masses will not be able to get those kind of houses.
So and housing is complex. So we cannot think of houses as products we buy off the shelf in a market or something. In most of the global south, in the countries, a lot of housing is done by people themselves and incrementally. It's not like it's a finished product. It's a lifetime project. So initially, to begin with, maybe there's only one room, and then they add something, and then they add a first floor. So it's a kind of, as economic, situation improves, they keep building constantly. So in that sense, Cole mentioned about building codes not being suitable. It's not that they're not suitable. There are building codes, etc. Every country, but whether they can be enforced, because a lot of this could also be unorganized or informal sector activity.
Yes.
So municipal corporation or governments would not have the capacity to go and inspect every house, and I think it will be impractical as well. So we need to kind of think in terms of how we can educate more people in terms of simple steps that they could take to make houses, whatever they're building, to make them more resilient, creating those kind of, the people who survived, 6 days, 7 days, etc. They are the ones who survived. Luckily, they got stuck under the air pocket. So, the building did not collapse on them. It collapsed all around them, but they got stuck in an air pocket. So that, I think, is a very positive thing to think of. So how these buildings can kind of, maybe include those aspects, if you like,
But do you think it's something that a government should do to make sure that they reinstate, to make sure that this kind of things are done, you have to...
Yeah.
I think it's government.
It's possible.
It is.
Government can do something, in the sense government, of course, needs to have regulation and needs to have the ability to enforce those regulations. But as I said, it's not easy to enforce those regulations, and they can make it actually more housing unaffordable for more people.
Yes.
So there has to be a kind of a pragmatic and a realistic approach. Government has to do those, but also we need much more in terms of grassroots based, education, training opportunities for these people on how to build, walls, how to build things, and how we can make, with simple kind of techniques, how we can make them, not earthquake proof, but at least earthquake a little bit resistant.
And government should be able to make it cheaper so that everyone can afford it. That's another good thing.
Yeah, I just want to add with this, Prof, with what you said. So, where you come from, we've not really had this kind of experience, but the closest we have had is collapsing of buildings. And so, in a place of it's even so worse that the buildings are not built to stand on its own without even the earthquake. So you have a building less than, even still in construction. There was a popular one in one of the high-rise areas in Lagos State, Nigeria, and the building cost billions of dollars. It's actually a high-rise, the top echelon of people who were already purchasing flats in millions of naira, or conversion, that is thousands of pounds. And before they even completed it, the building collapsed.
With a lot of the owners.
Yes, still in. Even I think one of the owners died.
Yeah, one of the owners died.
So I would say to a very large extent that the government is very responsible to ensure or to enforce this, because if everybody decides to make any building, because you collect taxes, you're the one who approved the C of O's for these lands. So I think they should monitor
is a sector they should monitor.
Absolutely. No, I think in most countries the regulations definitely apply for anything which is more than one-story building. I think the regulations become stringent. If it is a multi-story building, if it is a commercial building, in the sense that if it's a building where somebody is building houses for others, as opposed to what I gave earlier is an example of where a family is building their own house gradually. That's different. But any such commercial transaction has to be regulated properly. There needs to be, those kind of prior permissions to be taken and inspection mechanisms and things like that. So, we know that's a different kind of tragedy, but, when Rana Plaza incident happened in Bangladesh, where, thousands of textile workers were stuck in this very, very, kind of a very hot fire and the building, So from that, in Bangladesh, they introduced quite a large number of, kind of regulatory mechanisms that any such commercial complexes have to follow through. There is a lot of checking of fire regulations and everything. So I think that's a similar kind of situation.
Nepal did something similar, didn't they? When
the UN aid said that this is the worst they've had in 100 years. So I wanted to ask, do you think that there should be like a way they would improve the machinery and to predict and reduce this type of impact?
So as I mentioned, there is nothing, we can. There is no technology or anything is there to predict earthquakes. We can't. But once it starts to happen, we can have. More important is, I think, kind of creating that education and awareness. You mentioned about Japan. So in Japan, not only that buildings are built more resilient, etc., but right from nursery school and primary school, in every, like we have fire drill here in our university, right? At the beginning of semester, one day, all our health and safety colleagues will come and there is a fire alarm goes. We all have to come out and they're monitoring, right? So similarly, we have to kind of educate people in living in earthquake-prone zones about, okay, if there is a warning,
do something.
Either under the table or, go out, orderly. So that kind of a training, in Japan, I'm told that they're trained in that from childhood.
Wow.
So that, so one is the infrastructure part, which you mentioned, but this other is the education and creating that awareness. I think that's also can help to reduce. But there is no machinery or anything that can predict earthquakes. I mean, we can have various probes and things, but it's very, very expensive. And it's like trying to catch in the sky where the next shooting star is going to come. Sometimes you can predict, sometimes, because bigger asteroids, we have telescopes so we can predict, but most smaller ones we don't know that debris can fall. So it's a similar.
Sure. According to Al Jazeera, it says that 5 million people are homeless right now, which is quite high, very high. How do you think we can deal with this migration of these homeless guys? What do you think is the best solution to be able to migrate these homeless guys?
Yeah, I think. As I said, this is within the context of already about 13 million people who were displaced by the conflict and war, in Syria alone. So, again, we are thinking in terms of a technological solution, if you like, where we can build nice houses for them or where we can settle them. But maybe these are people who want to live in this region because it is their ancestral kind of communities and this is where they belong and things like that. So any rehabilitation also has to be bottom up, if you like, and it has to be. We should not relocate them somewhere else, which is alien place for them. So we need to find ways to rehabilitate them as close to their villages, as close to their towns as possible, and bring them back into whatever economic activity they were doing, and then rebuild that economy. It's tough because it's not easy and it requires coordinated effort. So that's where I think earthquake exposes these weaknesses in our society in terms of the governance.
Is it weaknesses?
Weaknesses that in the sense that governance quality, lack of institutions, and things like that. So then now when you are trying to rebuild, it's not just the houses, it's not the physical structures we have to rebuild. We have to rebuild the communities. We have to rebuild
lack of preparedness too.
So the capacity to govern themselves, that's what you have to rebuild.
Well, a lot of people will say that, it's you thinking in the negative part when you start thinking, let's start preparing for an earthquake. That's what they say.
Exactly. I think
do you think
if you're living on a fault line, I think it's only responsible to be
prepared for
it. I think it's just being prudent.
Also, traditional housing in those regions would always have been very kind of low impact kind of housing. But,
oh wow!
Because if you think of that, you mentioned Nepal, you mentioned other things.
Yes.
So in all these earthquake regions, the traditional housing is kind of of mud structures, for example. If they collapse, also they don't cause too much damage and easy to rebuild. I'm not trying to romanticize those kind of houses. No, not at all. Because those houses don't serve the purpose for weather. It's quite cold in Syria, so
cold.
it has to be thermal. But we need to learn from those principles. But we need to bring the best of the technology, but combine with that kind of local knowledge, so that we can produce solution which is ecologically appropriate for that region.
Would you prefer a solution of them migrating them to another country?
I don't think that's appropriate. That's what I was trying to say. In the sense that is never a solution, because they want to live in their land, their communities, and their history and heritage is all there. So relocating them somewhere else is kind of erases all of those opportunities. If they themselves choose to go somewhere else, that's different. But us trying to put them somewhere
else, I
think engineered solutions.
Cole, you had another question.
Well, it was kind of a follow-on from the building codes and regulations. Yeah, it was. I don't want to maybe keep rehashing this point, but I mean, one idea that I had, I don't know if you would agree with this, that so in the pursuit of developing better standards, better codes, better regulations, I thought, is there a risk of actually, because so many workers in such countries work informally in these construction sectors, is there a chance that these workers could potentially face new barriers to entry, and are you creating additional problems by trying to solve? I mean, obviously it's a worthwhile goal, trying to get safer building regulations, but are these workers essentially, do they face new barriers to entry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very, very good point. So that's why I mentioned, the idea of education. So the education not only about the ordinary people being educated, but also in terms of building the skills of the workers, and trying to ensure that they can have their livelihood at the same time. They have the opportunity to integrate this knowledge. So upskilling, we can call it. So I think those are very important. Otherwise, the danger is that we replace, a plan, how you are going to do, and what is your best case scenario, where do you want to get to, even though you can only afford one room today, but what is your vision, so it kind of encourages them to think in terms of, okay, if I need to in future build more, what am I going to do? So the skills, not only in terms of how to lay the bricks and how to do those things, but also in terms of these kind of planning skills, and then the finances also. So a lot of housing is a very expensive activity, so we need to have appropriate housing finance mechanisms for that. Most of housing finance is informal. People have to borrow from friends, and it happens all the time, or they take loans, they sell cattle, and all kinds of things.
Mortgage.
Yeah, if they can get a mortgage, I think they're very lucky. I mean, so there's only a small proportion of people who can get a mortgage in Lagos or in other places. So a lot of people are outside the formal system. So how we can develop, in terms of the financing mechanisms and tools for those kinds of people. There's a lot of informal market, which is also very expensive. We know that the interest rates tend to be very, very high. So how we can, Grameen Bank, as you may know, in Bangladesh, and BRAC, both of them, they have done a lot of work in this area, building kind of local level credit, kind of
affordable,
credit kind of societies and things like that. So what happens is, suppose you have 100 traders, all of them are working on cash. So everyone has, doesn't need cash at the same time. So you create a kind of a, rotating savings and credit, society, something like that. So that then, every year 10 people can build their home. So if there are 100 people, there isn't enough money for all 100 of them to build, but the remaining 90 people are saving, and the 10 people are borrowing. So it's kind of taking formal banking principles and putting it into this kind of a small-scale grassroots. We did a lot of work in Tajikistan with the Aga Khan Development Network and Aga Khan Foundation, and they found, similarly in the Pamir Mountains and, in this kind of, both in Afghanistan and in Tajikistan, they built from grassroots this kind of ability of individuals to save and become part of this kind of a saving and credit society. Over a period of time, that has grown into a sizable, like a bank itself.
Bro, that kind of structural policy, it requires a lot of trust, because somebody wouldn't want to drop out his old savings. Like a student, the old money I've saved for the past probably £2,000, and I give it to somebody, and when I need the money back, someone tells me,
no, you wait 10 years. no,
That's why it tends to happen in kind of smaller communities, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I don't know if everyone will agree with me, but I feel like the Ministry of Infrastructure or Ministry of Building are really not doing a good job, because I feel like these are the type of things that they should be able to, schemes that they should be able to introduce. Because if I know that if I have access to funds to be able to build a good do a good infrastructure that will be able to withstand that type of earthquake, I would want to look into it, because at the end of the day, it's really tragic. Anyway, we've been talking about the southern Turkey and the northern Syria, the 7.8 magnitude, the series of earthquakes that have been going on in that country. Our heart really goes out to them. It's really devastating. A lot of homes, a lot of children have lost their homes. A lot of families have been torn apart from this very, very sad emergence, and it's quite sad. I've been chatting with Adeoye and Cole, and of course Professor Anand.
I have a question before we round up. I just have a follow-up on what do you think is post the best for it? When do you think those communities can be rebuilt? I'm talking of the landscape. Where can the developers come back to the land, reassess it, and probably make it more suitable to build their homes back on it, so these individuals can get back to their home communities?
No, I think, first of all, we should be careful not to criticize any particular ministry or department. We're generally talking about, governance capacity and, in terms of that, because, they will say, oh, you are sitting in England in the comfort of, University of Bradford, and throwing accusations. So we should be careful in the sense. We understand, these are all complex challenges, and our whatever we are trying to say is, in terms of over long term, I think this kind of governance and quality of institutions have to improve. That is the only way in which societies have tried to overcome these kind of challenges. So I think that evidence is very clear from various kind of historical studies. On this particular issue, in terms of it. So in any kind of disaster, so immediate kind of steps is providing human security immediately. So securing, again, rescuing efforts and rehabilitating people for immediate kind of health and various needs, etc. And as soon as that is over, so once that phase is over, I think you are into this kind of a planning of rehabilitation phase. So that's where I think discussions, dialogues need to take place, and there is a lot of rubble has to be cleared, all those buildings have to be cleared, etc. So that is expensive, it's not easy, it involves a lot of work and labor, who is going to pay for that, etc. So these are some of the fundamental questions. If there is no money available, people then do it by themselves.
That's what I was going to ask. Are countries donating?
I think the Qatari has been the biggest donator to the
many countries are kind of of course in the first priority is to rescue people, so a lot of countries immediately sent their teams of rescuers, etc. So that phase is over. So then in the second phase, when you're trying to get into kind of the reconstruction, rehabilitation phase. So now I think, this is where, again, long-term development assistance is also needed. So development banks and others also will be looking into, in terms of how they can lend, because some of the infrastructure damaged, it cannot be built by individuals. So there needs to be some kind of, World Bank and other kind of agencies will kind of start to come in. This is where it gets complicated. It comes back to the situation about the war, because the conflict situation has not, completely ceased. So, to what extent the temporary truce that has been provided for humanitarian assistance can be extended further for, kind of a cooperation to establish at least some of the groundwork that can be done. So this is a kind of a three phases. One is immediate. One is kind of intermediate in the next 12 to 18 months, what needs to happen.
Yeah,
and
I was
then,
going to ask you that
and
question.
then, you know,
When
next
do you
10 years.
think, exactly, when do you think we're going to have Adana back? That's Turkey. When do you think it's going to, what do you think, is there
It will take 10
time
years.
frame?
It will take
10
10 years. I
years.
would think so, yeah. 10 years if you're lucky, yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
with so
yeah.
much donation.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Professor, for chatting with us. It's been a very educating session with you, as always. We've been chatting with Dr. Anand. Of course, he's a specialist in environmental economics and public policy, with a focus of the interface of urban economy, environment and sustainability. Dr. Anand has held various leadership positions. Part of it is that he co-organized and led 2 international workshops at Cambridge and a major international conference at Bradford. Of course, he is our professor also. He's my lecturer.
I should add, so the research I did, the team I worked with, born in Bradford, is also a very good team with born in Bradford.
Amazing.
So and it's a real pleasure for me, and also I think, you know, our department, Peace Studies and International Development, we work on quite a range of things. So obviously, the original founding was about peace in terms of, you know, conflicts, but we have significant specialization in that. We also have significant specialization in promoting human security, you know, reducing gender-based violence, but also in terms of economic, you know, development, economic growth, finance. So it's a very multidisciplinary department, and that's what brings us, you know, kind of together to think of these complex issues and try to explore how we can address them.
So, Professor, do you have any project or any research you're working on now?
Lots of. How much time have you got? No, absolutely no. So there are a few things we are trying to do. So obviously, you know, both local and global. So local, you know, as our Vice Chancellor says, this is a university for Bradford. So for us, trying to understand Bradford and surrounding region, and, you know, how we can contribute to improving, you know, in terms of especially environmental performance of companies, and how we can get to, you know, help them to get to net zero, etc. What are the challenges? So that's something we are trying to do at the moment. And globally, of course, you know, there are 2 things I will mention. So a lot of my work is focused on an approach called the capability approach, which is promoted by Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winner. So within the capability approach, it provides you a multidimensional framework to understand what is a good life and what is the aim of, you know. So when we think of this person who is affected by the earthquake, we should not think in terms of, oh, this person needs a house, so I'm going to build a house and give it to this person. But the idea is to ask, what is a good life for this person? What does it mean for them? So for them, it might mean, okay, having the freedom to enjoy the kind of a clean air in their city, or visit a, you know, monument, or be in the farm and just listening to the crops, you know, swaying in the wind, or things like that, you know. So those, I think, you know, how we can then empower them to achieve whatever is their good life. So that's what capability approach tells us. It should not be top down. It has to be, you know, each individual has the agency. We have to create that, you know, enabling framework, and give them that agency, or support their agency to realize their dreams. And so for me, I think, you know, it's really important, and in a way, in our work in the university, that's what we are trying to do. So that's one issue I mentioned. The other one is, of course, on sustainable cities. So everybody says sustainable cities, but if you really think about it, the challenge is huge and complex. It's just not, you know, easy. So it's very easy to pay lip service to it. It's not about recycling a little bit here and you know, doing a little bit there. So that will be greenwashing. That's really not, you know, sustainable. So we are long way away from really becoming, you know, sustainable cities. And in the next 20, 30 years, most of the, you know, kind of new growth of cities is going to happen in Africa, for example, next 30 years. So in that case, are we prepared? Are we there? You know, do we have the capacity to absorb all that urban growth? So we are kind of trying to look at, you know, how we can prepare better urban governance and make cities, you know, to be more resilient, to be able to, you know, take the opportunities.
Thank you so much, Professor Anand, for chatting with us. I'm sure that everyone has something to go back home with. I've been more enlightened. I'm so excited I had this chat with you. Our heart goes out to everyone out there who needs shelter, support, We are here praying for you, trust me. Thank you so much for joining us on today's show. Until we come your way again, my name is Cynthia.
Cole.
Adeoye.
And
I'm Anand. It's a really
and we
honor.
say have a beautiful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.